When I was first asked to curate Andy Warhol exhibition, it was hard not to be a little bit hesitant because there have been a great many. They've taken a certain path, a certain pattern. Why should we do another Warhol, and why now?
Why don't you ask me what art is?
What is it?
What is art? Art is short for artist.
Can anybody be an artist?
Yeah, if you say one day I want to be an artist, you just decide to be an artist, and it depends on how far you want to go.
We started to approach Warhol through three key lenses, which was the idea of Warhol's story and that of his families as being an immigrant story. Secondly, we wanted to, as it were, turn the volume up on his queer identity, the relationship between Warhol and the LGBTQ plus concerns of the present generation. And the final guiding principle was the idea of religion and death. And that was something that we felt very strongly needed to be represented in the show.
Many people have commented on the simplicity of Warhol's line drawings and their ability to succinctly convey emotion through a series of single lines. These solitary images of men can in many respects be representations of queer life in New York in the 1950s and point to Warhol's fascination with desire.
Andy grew up, in very poor circumstances. It was not only the Depression, but his father died when Andy was 12. His father was a coal miner. He did leave some money. He put money aside and told Andy's brothers all the time that this money is for Andy to go to college. So the father somehow knew that Andy was special. They were actually Ruthenian, which was this Slavic group from the Carpathian Mountains near the border of Slovakia and Ukraine and Poland. He would tell stories about how his brothers took care of him and how they all struggled through the Depression. But it was more about his mother. He was clearly her favorite. He was the baby who needed to be protected. Andy, from a very young age, I think, got very wrapped up in the idea of becoming famous. He was a sickly child. He had a disease called St. Vitus dance when he was 8 years old, and his mother had him in bed for almost a year, reading these fanzines, these magazines the Hollywood studios would put out. And I think Andy got very caught up in that whole idea of being a star, being famous. I think he understood that mystery keeps the press coming back.
Having your photo taken in a photo booth for a portrait is quite interesting because unlike with any other form of portraiture, because the photo booth machine develops the photo there and then, it means you don't have to be embarrassed when you take the photo negative to the developer. And so the photo booth becomes a kind of interesting site for performance.
As you look at the early painting of Warhol taken in a photo booth, you should see where he's looking. The idea of this exhibition and the way that we've positioned some of the works, especially this one, is the relationship that it forms with the film in the next room. And it's here that you'll find the film Sleep. It's a very loving portrayal of his then partner, John Giorno. This great beat poet, this wonderful artist. And I think it's that sense of tenderness mixed with a slightly mechanical eye. And it was shot over several evenings. It's not just this one-take wonder. It's quite elaborate. You can imagine the affront of this work at the time of its making when it was shown in cinemas, experimental or not. People were angry at the film. People were inclined to walk out. And I think it's the beginning of a kind of filmmaking with Warhol, almost the kind of filmmaking where you don't actually need to see the film at all. The actual making of it was almost enough. Sleep is going to be a film that many people will walk in, they'll catch a moment, everyone will catch a different moment. It's just nice to spend some time with it.
Do you just paint to please people?
Yes, because I think that's what art is. It's entertainment and pleasing people.
You're coming into a room where you're going to see some of the most recognizable works, not just made by Warhol, but in the history of art of recent years. And we want you to see the transition from an early Warhol trying to kind of break into a new world. And it's that moment very early on, you'll see some of those early works where he's struggling with this. He's hand painting. It's a sense of consumable objects, but it's also a little bit through the lens of painterly experience as well. And then, suddenly comes the stencil, suddenly comes the Coke bottles, and then, most importantly, comes the silkscreen. He's very interested in being an artist. He's very much wanting to gain recognition. And he makes that magnificent leap into his own style.
But what's fascinating about looking at the black and white image is that every single one is different, although it's the exact same process. And Andy Warhol really rejoiced in this sameness but this difference. He really liked the fact that silk screens were not a uniform result. And we think he started from the bottom and worked up. So the first one on the bottom left is very perfect, and then they become, slightly different as they go up, and then he will return to the bottom because the bottom edge is very straight. And then gradually, as he gets towards the right, he doesn't add any more ink, and so the images fade away to nothing. We think the other canvas, the coloured canvas, was started in the same way. It started with the black and white print, and then he painted them. And initially, they were never meant to be together, but when the person who bought the paintings came to the studio, saw them and said, oh, they should be together. So they became a diptych at that point. His whole ethos in life was to remove the hand of the artist, but it being a very early one, he hadn't yet done that. And it's fascinating looking at the painting really closely because you can see single brush strokes and you can really see the hand of the artist.
You're looking at one of Warhol's best-known series depicting the Campbell soup can. He'd achieved his first major success with an exhibition at the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles in 1962, where he depicted a row of Campbell soup can paintings arranged on a shallow shelf. In contrast to Warhol's early works, where he often included painterly brush marks, in this work he used a stenciling process, which is arranged on a single canvas so that the painting, when seen from afar, appears almost abstract, and it's only when you get up close to it that you're able to see them as individual cans of soup.
Andy's mother cleaned houses for $1 a day after the father died. Andy told me that they would have salt and pepper soup, which is hot water with salt and pepper. If they had ketchup, it became tomato soup. People would sometimes say, oh, come on, Campbell soup cans, or oh, come on, whatever Andy was doing, it's a joke, right? It's a joke. And you say, well, it is a joke, but it's not a joke. The English really got that idea, a joke that's not a joke. But Americans were so literal and wanted to categorize everything. And I think Americans also recognized subconsciously themselves in Andy's art, this extreme consumerism that Andy was both celebrating and critiquing. The first factory, which was in the East 40s and was the famous Silver factory, it had all the walls covered in tin foil, and that's where the wild parties were happening, and that's where, the Doors would show up, and the Rolling Stones, and a lot of so-called superstars, which was Andy's word for these various characters who talked a lot and were willing to stand in front of his camera and just pour their hearts and sex lives out Edie Sedgwick was one who became best known. When she died, and I said to Andy, "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, "Oh, who cares? Just another girl who overdosed." I mean, he was so heartless at times like that. And he would be, "Bob, if I had feelings, I'd have a nervous breakdown."
I tend to look onto the Silver Clouds as just brilliant toys, and they are, in a way, that wonderful escape from painting. He begins to kind of play with this idea of I'm leaving everything behind. One of the views held is that this might be Warhol taking a poke at the likes of Donald Judd, who was producing rather serious minimalist sculpture. But this is almost like Warhol's kind of undoing of the macho artist.
Culture is slowly disappearing. I guess actually it goes in two directions. It goes up and down, and hard and soft. And I guess anything that is the easiest is really culture.
Exploding Plastic Inevitable is a 17-channel video installation, so that means that there's 17 different projections, also with an audio soundtrack and a disco ball as well. Exploding Plastic Inevitable was installed in an 8-meter by 8-meter room. So one of the largest challenges is that the ceiling there is not weight-bearing, and so we had to install supports in different areas prior to the time of the installation period. We had a team of 4 people that worked every day for the entire day just dedicated to that work, and it took us 2 weeks. And that was in addition to some of our electricians also had to lay down and place the supports ahead of time as well.
In an interesting way, Warhol now is really alive and alert to things, and so with the Velvet Underground, there's that sense of him playing with his film and the band, which is what you get around the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, which is the famous multimedia light shows that toured America as well as being in New York. And I think what's important to see there is that sort of way in which you can see an overspill of the work that he's doing in film that suddenly being projected over a band in front of a live audience. And we've been very lucky to work together with the Warhol Museum to, as it were, recreate this using what is known to be some of the original footage at the time and certainly some of the original Velvet Underground music.
When we reopened after the coronavirus closure, then we had to reevaluate all of the spaces in the entire museum to try to avoid instances where people could accidentally bump into each other. So narrow, dark corridors are obviously a little bit off limits there. So sadly, we had to close Exploding Plastic Inevitable, but we did make a video walkthrough of it and left the audio soundtrack on so that when visitors come to this space, they can at least get an idea of what the room would be like.
This room is the hinge between what we know of the 60s Warhol and what you're about to come into, which is the 70s and onwards Warhol.
There's this moment where things are beginning to change and people around him are beginning to change. And there comes a moment in all this where Warhol is still trying to do his business of, as it were, bringing home the bacon, his most common expression of trying to make money and exist, because he's got a big team to support. And he has a sort of film wing at this point, and he has various other sort of things on the go. And I get the feeling that just when they thought things were settling in June 1968, a rather unsettled individual called Valerie Solanas, who's not in a good place. She's written a script, she gives it to him, he promptly, for whatever reason, seems to have misplaced it. And so there's definitely, it's not that Valerie Solanas is unknown to Warhol, but there clearly is a degree to which Valerie becomes passionately angry toward him that of which he must have been unaware. She shoots at him twice, misses, and the third shot, the bullet pierces every major organ except his heart.
He was rushed to Mother Cabrini Hospital, where 5 surgeons operated for 5 hours and told Paul Morrissey and Jed Johnson that this man will probably, when he comes off the anesthesia, go into shock and then a coma. He's just been so traumatized by both the shooting and the operations. Instead, Andy woke up and was like sort of okay. And the doctor said this man made up his mind he was going to live the minute those bullets hit him. And Andy was extremely strong-willed. He feigned this kind of weak, helpless thing, and which made us all very protective of him. He had a stronger will than anyone I knew.
In this image by Richard Avedon, the photographer presents Warhol's torso on its own, almost as a saintly object. Because of the stitches in Warhol's torso, he actually said in an interview that his body now looked like an Yves Saint Laurent dress. So despite this being an extremely serious and sad part of Warhol's life, he was still able to use humour as a way to deal with these traumatic moments.
What do you want most in the whole world?
Well, I think health is the most important thing in the whole world.
Why do you think that?
Well, if you have health, you feel like $1 million.
Although Warhol had famously declared his retirement from art in the mid-1960s, in this room you'll see his painting depicting the former communist leader Chairman Mao, and you'll also see his skull series and one of the hammer and sickle paintings.
When Andy came back to painting, let's say, in 72, 4 years after he'd been shot, he started in on this Mao Zedong series. The way that happened is Bruno Bischofberger turned up at the factory one day from Switzerland and said, Andy, I have a great idea for you. I want you to paint the most famous person of the 20th century, Albert Einstein. And Andy was like, oh no, he's not the most famous person of the 20th century. Mao is the most famous person. Mao sold 1 billion little red books. And I said, Andy, Mao did not sell 1 billion little red books. People were forced to take them. But anyway, so Andy did Mao, and they were unveiled at the Palais Galliera in Paris. It was an absolutely stunning show. And Andy was back. And again, in Europe, people raved. In America, not so much. The leading art critic for Time magazine said of Andy's commissioned portraits that he embalmed his clients in the back of their limousines.
Warhol suffered personal loss in this period. In 1972, his mother, who had been living with him for most of his adult life, passed away in Pittsburgh. And it was an event that he actually didn't tell many of his friends about, but which we wanted to reference through this video that he took of his mother, which was filmed not that long before her death.
The way we all found out was Andy's boyfriend, Jed Johnson, who also was editing Andy's films and decorating Andy's house. But Jed answered the phone one Sunday, and Andy's brother John would call every Sunday, and Jed said, oh, nice to speak to you, John. How's your mother? How's Julia? And he said, Andy didn't tell you? Our mother died 2 years ago? And that was so typical of Andy to be so cold about emotions and so shut off. in his ability to just, tell his closest friends, his boyfriend, my mother died, and maybe cry or something. But he couldn't share the fact that I guess the pain he felt, it was weird.
Ladies and Gentlemen was another commission by Warhol's Italian dealer, Luciano Anselmino. The dealer actually asked Warhol to depict what he called funny-looking drag queens, or drag queens who are 5 o'clock shadow. And so what started as a series that seemed to be quite insensitive to the reality of life if you are gender non-conforming, actually resulted in a painting series that really display the kind of fluidity that gender can sometimes express. Given the fact that Warhol was not part of the trans community and the subjects depicted in Ladies and Gentlemen Warhol did not personally know, the series throws up questions around the relationship between the artist and model. Is it possible to appreciate these works while acknowledging the fact that Warhol was not part of this community?
Andy has always been fascinated by cross-dressing. So I think these series, to me, they're really close to Andy's, I guess in some way you could say heart, but just close to his fascination with images and how people can change their image and transform themselves. And everybody was having fun, I mean, it wasn't such innocent fun, but it was fun. I don't know, the 70s, everybody wanted to see everything. Everybody wanted a mix, It was also part of this openness, and sense of adventure. So Vincent and I started asking these girls if they would pose for a friend of ours the next day and get paid $50. We never used Andy's name. They didn't really know who he was anyway.
I just sort of paint portraits now because it helps us produce another movie. I'm a commercial person.
Why?
Well, I've got a lot of mouths to feed. Got to bring home the bacon.
Warhol's world is represented in this room at the point at which you're seeing an extremely lively New York. New York's now coming out of the kind of grungy 60s. It's become the place of disco. It's become the place of Wall Street corporate kind of cool, as it may have been seen then. And in there is Warhol documenting this. And he really does pick up on the rise of the celebrity. He was always very close to Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones, and they had a great friendship over many years. And you'll see here these rather wonderful images of Mick Jagger.
Fred Hughes, who is this kid from Rice University in Houston, Andy hired him at like age 25 or 26 to be his manager. And Fred really basically started him in on the commissioned portrait business. I mean, that's what was financing Interview, financing the video projects. And Andy encouraged me and everyone else, oh, Bob, you got to pop the question. Tell them they have to have their portraits done. And I became pretty good at that.
Oxidation painting was made by Warhol and his assistants urinating onto a canvas that was prepared with metallic paint. The reaction of the urine with the paint would create these strange abstract marks across the canvas. Unlike most of Warhol's works throughout his career, which use the silkscreen process and often depict photographic imagery, oxidation painting is an example of him exploring abstraction.
In the penultimate room is a painting of the Statue of Liberty. It actually comes from the lid of a biscuit tin, unusually, but his own parents came through Ellis Island, and to this day they're recorded on the memorial wall as one of the many immigrant families who came into America and entered the country that way. So I think that's a very important painting for us to have in the show. It's not just a pop object. It must have had some resonance for him. And similarly, the red image of Warhol against a black background, for me, it's the death mask. It's the moment where Warhol perhaps reveals more than anything in a very intimate portrait shot that this is a man, as it were, knowing of his future. These are borrowed years.
I know that Andy was factually and biographically, Andy was an outsider. As his brother said, they were the misfits. They were Ruthenian, and no one knew what that was. I remember one year we were having his birthday party, and we were all dancing, and Andy's like standing at the edge. So I went over and said, "Come on, Andy, you should dance." "Oh, I don't know how to dance, Bob." And he was like, "Gee, you kids are having so much fun." He would say these things so wistfully, Instead of being the center, you would think, he was the outsider on the edge.
I think that this particular room is really about bringing into mind the past life, maybe even the world behind the Iron Curtain of Lenin, and this sense of the old country, perhaps. We're very lucky to have this painting in London and to have this painting as part of the show. 60 Last Suppers is a phenomenal work. It is one of the penultimate paintings produced by Warhol. This work, more than any other, has a certain, or any other of the Last Supper series, has a certain straightforwardness about it. It is literally one Last Supper, then another, then another, then another, printed in rows. It is, in my view, one of the most mechanical and the most deathly of his paintings. And it shows that way in which it is death that is processed, as well as life. Remember that these paintings create an experience. They create an experience around them. And I often think that's true of Warhol's work throughout. And sometimes it isn't whoopee-doo pop. It is a somber aesthetic. It is a relationship being formed where you are confronted with mortality.
He was in terrible, terrible pain at the opening in Milan, which was held in a palazzo across the street from the church where Leonardo's Last Supper hung. And he died a couple of weeks after the opening. So it seems like, it all came full circle. But it also seems a shame that he died at 58 years old, and who knows what else he would have done.
How do you tell the difference between a good painting and a bad painting? Well, I really never think of that because I can't really tell. Well, I don't think people really like art. They just, it's just displayed nicely in museums. It's something to go to on Sunday afternoon.